Hey everybody, welcome back to my channel. This is Heidi from My Reading Life, and I'm here today to film my review video for the Book Naturalist Book Club month of January pick. So in January, we have been doing an author spotlight on Rachel Carson. And for this month, I read two books by Rachel Carson. I read The Sea Around Us and I read Silent Spring. So I will be talking about those two books specifically in detail, and I will also be talking about Under the Sea Wind, which I read back in November. But before I get started to talk about the individual books, I just wanted to give you a little bit of information about Rachel Carson herself, because I think she was truly an amazing person, really a trailblazer, not only for environmentalism, which she was basically the godmother of in the United States, but also for women in the sciences. So Rachel Carson grew up in the early part of the 1900s in the state of Pennsylvania in the United States. She went off to college and completed her master's degree in 1932. And she was one of only a very few women at the time who studied in the field of marine sciences. She couldn't find a mentor. She didn't have any money. She came from a poor family. And so she couldn't continue on in her studies to go on to earn a PhD. She had to just go and try to find work. So that's what she did. By 1936, she was a part-time, she had been hired to write scripts part-time for the radio for the Bureau of Fisheries. And she was writing about ocean life at that time. And she was also freelancing to write articles for the Baltimore Sun newspaper, and she obviously had a lot of writing talent that had shown up from a very young age with her. And while she struggled financially, she realized at that point that she could combine the two things that she loved the most, which was writing and sciences. And so she was a trailblazer in that way as well. It was not normal for women to be either working in the sciences or writing about the sciences. When she wrote for the Baltimore Sun and when she was producing these radio scripts, she wrote under the name R.L. Carson so that people would assume that she was a man. So she was breaking barriers in the sciences as a scientist, and she was also pushing back against this idea that women couldn't be writers, and she had to do this age-old thing that women have had to do from time immemorial, which is use initials so that people will just assume that you're a man and they will therefore read your writing. I just think it's a travesty that somebody as talented as Rachel Carson would have to hide her identity in that way. But it was certainly, common at the time and even before that and even today. I mean, when you think of writers like J.K. Rowling, no matter what her politics, she still had to use initials so that people would buy her book. And that was in the modern times. Crazy. So in 1937, she finally got hired as a junior aquatic biologist for the Bureau of Fisheries. And she was only one of two women that was hired to work in that professional capacity by the Bureau of Fisheries. By 1939, the Bureau of Fisheries had turned into the U.S. Department of the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service. So, that was basically the precursor for today's major fish and wildlife department that regulates in the environment for wildlife habitat for the United States. By 1949, she was the editor-in-chief of all of the agency's publications, the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, all of their publications. She was the editor-in-chief because once people found out what a talented writer she was and what a talented editor she was basically stuck editing everybody else's papers as well as her own. That, of course, lessened the amount of time that she had to do her own writing. And so she had published Under the Sea Wind in 1941, and she didn't publish The Sea Around Us, which was the follow-up book after Under the Sea Wind, until 1951. And then Silent Spring came out in 1962, and unfortunately, Rachel Carson died in 1964. Just after this got published, while she was writing this, and while she was dealing with the pushback and the just bitter awful things that the chemical companies were saying about her, all the while that was happening, she was fighting breast cancer. So yeah, it was really difficult for her. And then she did end up, she was only 56. She was only 56 years old when she passed away. So tragically, a loss of a great mind at a very early age. Really sad and really awful to think that here was this woman, this brilliant scientist and writer who had just written this amazing publication She gets vilified, of course, by a big industry, which, of course, doesn't want the public to listen to what she has to say about any of this. They call her all kinds of names. They try to make her out to be a hysterical woman. Of course, hysterical woman. God forbid a woman be spouting the facts and telling you like it is, because you must be hysterical. Some things never change. So that's the background for Rachel Carson. Personally, I find her to be a hero to me. I think she's exactly the type of person that I, would like to imagine I myself to be. I'm not a writer, obviously, but her depth of knowledge and her caring about the environment and about the world around us is exactly the type of the value system that I have myself. So I really valued the chance to read her books. So I did talk about and review Under the Sea Wind by Rachel Carson back in November. This is her book about the sea, specifically about birds and fish that live either in the sea or use the winds and the habitat around the sea to survive. And it's told from the point of view of those creatures. It is just the most charming book, and it really does allow you to see things from the animal's perspective and to gain empathy for living creatures who are not human. And I think it's really a lovely book that anybody could read and get a lot out of and really find enjoyment of. It is not like a hugely scientific tome. It is not difficult to read. It is a little short book. So if you're looking for a way into Rachel Carson's work, I think this is a really good place to start. I picked up and read The Sea Around Us by Rachel Carson. Now, she wrote 3 or 4 books sort of in this loose grouping all about marine ecology. And this is specifically about the ocean and about the physical characteristics of the ocean. So this deals with ocean currents. It deals with temperature, it deals with salinity, it deals with the tides, all of the physical and chemical processes by which the ocean works. This book delves into. Like I said, it was published in 1951, and so it is a product of its time. And Rachel Carson acknowledges throughout this book that she is detailing the state of knowledge as she knows it at the time in the early 1950s. And she acknowledges that, that there's many fields within oceanography and marine sciences that are on the cusp of learning new important information, and she just simply didn't have that information at hand. So yeah, this book, again, is just so lovely. It is not charming in the way that Under the Sea Wind is. It is very much more a scientific exploration of a subject, but still Rachel Carson brings her lyrical writing style to this. I think it still is, it is just amazing. Of course, because of my specific interest in life and my own field of study, I found this book to be right up my alley, because all things marine science and marine ecology are interesting to me. But I think that anybody who is interested in ocean topics or marine sciences or marine ecology would find this of interest. It's also just a lovely book. The type is quite small in this particular edition, but has lovely pencil illustrations, especially between the 3 different parts. It's set up into 3 different sections. It's got these lovely pages at the beginning of the book. So the first section is Mother Sea, the second section is The Restless Sea, and the third section is Man and the Sea About Him. But it really does not go into man's impact on the ocean. It really is just about the physical properties, the chemical properties of the oceans. It's not about man's impact on the oceans at all. And just so you can understand the kind of language that she writes in, let me just read you this passage from the beginning of the chapter entitled The Changing Year. For the sea as a whole, the alternation of day and night, the passage of the seasons, the procession of the years are lost in its vastness, obliterated in its own changeless eternity. But the surface waters are different. The face of the sea is always changing, crossed by colors, lights, and moving shadows, sparkling in the sun, mysterious in the twilight. Its aspects and its moods vary hour by hour. The surface waters move with the tides, stir to the breath of the winds, and rise and fall to the endless hurrying forms of the waves. Most of all, they change with the advance of these seasons. Spring moves over the temperate lands of our northern hemisphere in a tide of new life, of pushing green shoots and unfolding buds, all its mysteries and meanings symbolized in the northward migration of the birds, the awakening of sluggish amphibian life as the chorus of frogs rises again from the wetlands. The different sound of the wind stirs the young leaves where a month ago it rattled the bare branches. These things we associate with the land, and it is easy to suppose that at sea there could be no such feeling of advancing spring. But the signs are there, and seen with understanding eye, they bring the same magical sense of awakening. It's just lovely. And she goes into a lot of things that I really am passionate about. The tides, the phytoplankton, all of these things that are really important part of my own life. She really describes them well. She actually talks about places near where I live in terms of the influence of the tides on those places, which was really cool. It's always neat to see a place that you know really well talked about in a book that you're reading. So yeah, I just absolutely love this book. It was, another 5-star read for me, just cemented my love for Rachel Carson. I then went on and I read Silent Spring, which is her most well-known piece of nonfiction. And this is her expose of what pesticides and chemicals were doing to the environment. So this book is very much about what humans do to the earth, to the environment, to other living creatures who live on planet Earth with us. And she was first brought to understand what was happening with chemical applications on the land by living in Pennsylvania and living around all the industry around creation of steel and coal and all that sort of thing, all the industries that were happening in Pennsylvania. She grew up in that environment, and that first opened her eyes to the impact that man could have on the world. She wrote this book basically in order to let people know what was happening, to raise awareness, because at this time in the late 50s, early 60s, people did not have an environmental consciousness the way that we do today. They simply did not understand. And you have to remember, it was the mid-20th centuries where technology was king. Atomic energy and all of the advancements that had happened around the atom was this cause for this idea that man could control everything, that man could create anything, and it would be better than what was already here. Rachel Carson, is in this book sounding the alarm that no, in fact, that's not the case. By taking these chemicals and applying them without knowledge of what the impact is going to be, we are actually harming not only ourselves, but the earth and all the creatures on it. And those impacts have far-reaching effects that we don't even know anything about yet, because we've never had these chemicals before. She was trying to get people to understand that we were putting things out there into the environment that we just had no idea what the end result was going to be. So again, I just want to read you a section here. This book has also lovely illustrations at the start of every chapter. This book is broken up into 17 chapters, and some people might say that is too much. There's too much information. This is a much more technical piece of nonfiction writing than the other two books about the ocean. But because of what she's trying to do here, she's trying to build a case for people to wake up and pay attention to what's going on around them, to understand that we needed to have more research done before we started widespread application of these poisons onto the earth and onto live creatures. Before we kept doing this, we needed to have more information. She's using lots of examples. She's bringing lots of case studies to bear, and that can get, if you're not interested in it, I think it could get overwhelming. So I understand the criticisms for this book, but for me, I was with her the whole way. I still did not mind, because I think her writing overcomes what could potentially be boring or just a lot of listing of examples, for me anyway. So I just wanted to read you this passage that is the start of chapter 11. The contamination of our world is not alone a matter of mass spraying. Indeed, for most of us, this is of less importance than the innumerable small-scale exposures to which we are subjected day by day, year after year. Like the constant dripping of water that in turn wears away the hardest stone, this birth-to-death contact with dangerous chemicals may in the end prove disastrous. Each of these recurrent exposures, no matter how slight, contributes to the progressive buildup of chemicals in our bodies, and so to cumulative poisoning. Probably no person is immune to contact with this spreading contamination unless he lives in the most isolated situation imaginable. And then it goes on to say, this piling up of chemicals from many different sources creates a total exposure that cannot be measured. It is meaningless, therefore, to talk about the safety of any specific amount of residue. In effect, then, to establish tolerances is to authorize contamination of public food supplies with poisonous chemicals in order that the farmer and the processor may enjoy the benefits of cheaper production, and then to penalize the consumer by taxing him to maintain a policing agency to make certain that he shall not get a lethal dose. But to do the policing job properly would cost money beyond any legislator's courage to appropriate, given the present volume and toxicity of agricultural chemicals. So in the end, the luckless consumer pays his taxes, but gets his poisons regardless. And that's the other thing about this book. While Rachel Carson did birth the environmental movement, and the Environmental Protection Agency was in fact created after this book was published, our system of environmental regulations was created, but in the end, there are a lot of the same things still happening. Pesticides are still being used in mass quantities in agriculture because we have decided as a culture that we want cheap food. And the only way to have cheap food is to grow it in an industrial way. And the only way to grow food in an industrial way is to use chemicals to do that. So while we did learn some things from this, and obviously our rivers in general don't light on fire anymore, and songbirds still come to our bird feeders, and people don't have quiet springs anymore. I think that there still is a lot of lack of knowledge of what's really happening in the world. People just are, they just aren't aware of what actually happens to produce the food that we eat, or to have a suburban community where you can sit out in your backyard and not be bitten alive by mosquitoes. These sorts of things happen because of application of chemicals. And sometimes we just don't pay close enough attention to what is happening to make this comfortable modern life for us. And that's the biggest point of Rachel Carson's work, is to say to all of us, please pay attention, look at what's happening, understand what's happening, be your own advocate, and make choices that you think are the best for yourself. Don't just assume that somebody else is going to make good, healthy choices for your own safety, because that isn't necessarily always the case. So yeah, I loved reading these books by Rachel Carson. I will certainly continue on. And read more books by Rachel Carson in the future. I think she's brilliant. I think she is just an amazing person. And I hope that you have given Rachel Carson a try this month. And if you haven't, I hope that you will pick her up in the future, because she's just absolutely brilliant. I hope you're all doing well and finding some great books to read, and I will talk to you later.